All right, hi everybody. Welcome back to the channel. I'm here again for Classic Reads with Mark Tiedemann, and today we're going to talk about Methuselah's Children, which is written by Robert A. Heinlein, one of the big guys in SF uh, authorship or whatever back in the 40s and 50s and 60s and I don't know to the 70s. But anyway, one of the big guys in the golden age of science fiction, like Asimov, and certainly one of those top names that we hear when you talk about science fiction. So welcome, Mark. Want to give us a little line about Methuselah's Children?
Methuselah's Children was one of the first Heinleins that I read, and I found it remarkable. He had a slew of stories throughout the 40s that would be considered bestsellers and game changers today. And in fact, over time, they did mark a change in the way science fiction was being done. Stories like Universe and If This Goes On and things like that. And Methuselah's Children is one of the better ones, I thought, because it dealt with topics it was published originally in Astounding in 1941. And some of the topics in it were about to become a big deal because World War II was upon us and everything that was going on in Germany and other places. It wasn't just Germany, with regard to isolated and marginalized groups of people and refugees in general. He touched on a lot of this. Now, from a contemporary standpoint, it might read like juvenilia or kind of weak tea. So I always caution people, if you pick up a novel from 1940, you have to take into account when it was written, what it was being compared to, and not flog it because it doesn't meet contemporary literary standards. That said, I think it demonstrated Heinlein's ability to, along with somebody like Mark Twain, he could just start telling a yarn and suck you in, and you just went with it. Because, of course, this is the logical progression of the story, and these characters are delightful. This was the introduction of Lazarus Long into what ultimately became a Heinlein canon, because Lazarus featured in at least two other novels later and was kind of a background character throughout a good deal of Heinlein's career. The novel deals with practical immortality. It deals with things like eugenics, which at that time did not have the evil connotations that it 5 years later did, and it deals with with misguided politics, as do most of Heinlein's novels. And in that sense, you could say, well, this must have been a radical novel, but he wrote it as an adventure. And so you could read it without paying much attention to those issues. But if you paid attention, there's some fairly deep waters going on here.
Yeah, I would think for modern readers, there's a couple things that you might find off-putting or whatever. Just remember that this was written like 80 years ago. At least in chapter 2, the male character is pretty condescending toward the female character, like, don't worry your pretty little head, my dear. Men are going to take care of this, and you can always trust a woman to like fly off the handle because they're so emotional, But there's very few female characters in the books. So there's not a lot of condescension later, and things seem to happen very easily that we don't want to necessarily, I guess, get stuck on. So they need to steal a starship, and they just manage to steal one. We need to invent some kind of funky drive to like cross interstellar space. Somehow this guy just sort of like invents it in like 3 pages or whatever. But that's not the point of the story. Is how are we going to develop faster than light travel? How are we going to do this? It's as you said, we've got other topics to get to, so those things just kind of get taken care of, right, to get back to the things that it wants to say. So don't be surprised when sort of like Deus Ex Machina, suddenly we have a starship, suddenly we have a drive that works, suddenly we can talk to the aliens or whatever. Those aren't the points of the story.
No, not really, but they weren't quite as glibly dealt with as the guy that invents the star drive is another character that recurs in Heinlein, Slipstick Libby. was the main character in a short story called Misfits. And he has a gift for seeing the underlying order of the universe in a particular way and can just solve problems, but he doesn't have any social skills. And you could argue that Heinlein's Misfits was an early story dealing with what we would recognize now as high functioning autism. But Heinlein never did do what a lot of science fiction writers made their bread and butter on, which was delve into the fictional underpinnings of the technology, and we're going to do it this way, and here's this and all that. He'd just say, well, no, there are people, we have a starship. Now what are you going to do with it? Never mind how it works. And the theft of the starship was kind of a, the most improbable aspect of the whole adventure, but it was laid in with a certain amount of logic. We can pull this stuff because who the hell would steal a starship? Mm-hmm. I mean, we can look at movies and TV shows from the 50s and see a level of security concern that's laughable today. Cops get talked out of arresting people on the slimmest of pretenses. Oh yeah, he's okay. He's supposed to be here. And we look at it now and go, what the hell's wrong with you people? He's got a bomb. That sort of thing. But it was also setting up the fact that, do we want to talk much about the basis of the story?
Yeah, I was going to say, once we kind of covered the things now that maybe a contemporary reader might find like, oh, this is not what I'm expecting. But the basis of the story is that some people live a very, very long time. They're not immortal, but they do live for 150, 200 years or something.
Lazarus is the oldest, and he's pushing 200.
And we see them, the chapter 1 is largely a committee meeting, which I also wouldn't start off a book with nowadays either. Too much sitting and talking to get readers into your first chapter. But it is a committee meeting where it's clear that whoever's the oldest person at the meeting has to run it. And the only reason somebody else ends up running it is because he doesn't admit to being the oldest one in the room, guys. He doesn't want to run it, right? And so they're like, who's the oldest? And someone finally says, well, I guess it's me, And so he runs it. And then someone's like, wait, Lazarus is here. Why didn't you say something? He's like, ah. So we have this whole family of people who have this, who live very, very long lives. So they've had to do a lot of stuff to stay hidden, right? They have to have a whole system of when you've lived enough time, you've got to get a new identity. And because someone's going to start to notice you're not aging as like they are, and that, it's been 50 years and you've only aged like 5 years and they're, a decrepit old man now or whatever. So, they have a whole system of like recycling their identities and becoming new people. And you've had this, we have to stay hidden from the ordinary people because, once the ordinary people know that people could live like 200 or 300 years, they're going to want to know how we did it, which is basically selective breeding. They don't actually have a secret per se. They're just trying to, which, that's another slightly unbelievable thing. At least in Dune, the Bene Gesserit have been trying to breed people for 10,000 years, But here we've been trying to breed people like 150 years or 200 years, and suddenly, we have immortal people or near immortal people or whatever. But so you take that, but then is there they do get found out. Some of them do say, hey, it's time to come out and say, hey, we're here. And the rest of the people will treat us nicely, maybe, and we can get along and whatever, which, of course, isn't what happens. So then
it's a comment on the naivete of civilization. We think we're more civilized than we actually are. You just haven't given people an opportunity to demonstrate their barbarity. The eugenics, the whole premise of the book is that it's the Howard families, and there's in fact nobody in the family of the bloodline of the founder, Howard, Mr. Howard, who was a very, very wealthy man who found himself dying of old age in his 40s, which when he was alive was not that uncommon. So he sets up a foundation which basically recruits people from long-lived families. And he says, okay, here's the deal. We'll give you this money. You can live very well if you marry from among our membership, because we're trying to match couples that will produce long-lived children. And you have to understand that prior to World War II, eugenics was a branch of the biological sciences that did not have the taint that it acquired after World War II. And yeah, it's kind of it's philosophically questionable, but there were people saying, well, it just makes sense. We do this with animals. Why can't we do it with people? Well, right in there is the reason why it's objectionable. We don't do, we treat people differently, but he was making it as voluntary as possible. And the success of the program was I guess it's about 200 years, little longer. Lazarus Long, who was born, Woodrow Wilson Smith, was born in 1904 or something like that. And he's now 200 years old. So that'll give you a timeline. Mary Sperling is the next oldest, and she's about 160. And they are considered extreme. We're talking about people who've now extended the human lifespan to, on average, about 120, 125, which, when the average life expectancy was not much past 60, that looks immortal. And in
not
between,
not just long lived, but they don't look 160, right? They didn't just.
They don't, right?
Yeah,
they don't.
She still looks 30 or 40 or something.
And the downside of this program is they've discovered that when the biological clock runs out, aging and death are very quick. Like within 2 years, you become decrepit and pass away. Mary Sperling herself is fearing that she's reaching that point. So that drives her motivations through the whole book. She doesn't want to die, but she thinks, I'm past the age when this stuff starts to happen. So that's the background. And there's been a revolution in between. You could reference Heinlein's novella, If This Goes On, about the revolution that happened in America. It's collected in a book called Revolt in 2100. And Lazarus and the others are survivors of that. Things have changed again. And yes, the condescension of that guy toward Mary Sperling. What's amusing in that is that Mary Sperling's friends are saying, she's been dating this politician and he looks like a good catch, which I hate. I've always hated that term. Even when I was a kid, I thought that was, and I said, well, why don't you marry him? And she keeps saying, well, he's too young. And of course, her friends are thinking, well, there's 3 or 4 years of difference between you? And she's thinking, no, there's about 100 years difference. And this just won't work out. So the meeting that you're referring to is to decide whether or not to start revealing themselves. They think that civilization has reached a point where people aren't going to freak out and they can start living openly. So they don't do it en masse. Some people are going to reveal themselves and the rest of them are going to be, and it goes horribly sideways. It turns out that people are not very mature and they will not accept the explanation that we've just gotten this way because this is how we are. No, there has to be a secret. You're hiding a secret from the rest of us. We deserve to have the secret of long life. And they get rounded up and put in a concentration camp, basically, which, like I said, this was published originally in 1941. In a couple of years, this was, important stuff. And the president of, I forget if it's the leader of the free world, so to speak, is trying to mitigate the worst aspects of this. And he objects strenuously to what his own government is doing and ends up throwing in with the Howard family. He's normal. And from his offices, he's able to set up a situation where they're able to steal the first starship that's set to go out. And the Howard families all decamp to the ship, and the ship leaves the solar system. And then they wander around for the rest of the novel, trying to find a place to set down and live, leading to, a series of adventures, which ultimately convince them that A, there really isn't any place like home. B, there are some aliens out here who will eat us for lunch. And C, what are we doing? So they opt to go home. And the irony, of course, of the book is that when they get home, ready to surrender themselves, the issue has been resolved, because when the Howard family left, humanity in its collective ingenuity set itself to the problem and came up with the cure that they thought the Howard families were hiding from them. So everybody's long-lived, and it's no big deal. Welcome home.
Mm-hmm.
In a lot of ways, yeah, wow, that doesn't sound like a particularly great novel, but it's a fun ride. And Heinlein's prose style and his characters are compelling and delightful, and you just go with it. And it's a very short novel, but I think underneath all of that, Heinlein was playing with some issues that were pretty significant, particularly for the times. How do you treat marginalized people? How do people go about self-selecting for their own in-group interests, and what are the responsibilities of the larger society toward those people? I mean, he doesn't actually put that on the page in any kind of a speech, but it's there through the whole book. And I thought, this is pretty advanced stuff for a kid growing up in the 40s and 50s. And the condescension, my opinion about the condescension of men toward women, or of any group that is cast in the role of social inferior or what have you, is, we like to think that we're getting over that. And it may well be that here and there we are. And we may, when we get through whatever we're going through now, come out the other side with a better handle on that. But that doesn't mean it's going to stick. Mm-hmm. So I think it's perfectly acceptable for anybody to write a science fiction novel set 50 or 100 years in the future, where all of the crap that we thought we had solved is back again.
Well, I mean, there's certainly people today openly saying that, women should never have had the right to vote, and we should be repealing,
Yeah, all that.
So, it doesn't go away. And so those paragraphs where he's talking about stuff like that, I had marked another one later in the book that said, this is pretty contemporary, where again, they were talking about, well, the government's coming out and rounding up people or whatever. And it's like, well, there are still governments doing that, clearly even ours. So those things are kind of ageless.
Yeah. And that kind of set Heinlein apart from most of his contemporaries at that time, which is why he's still being argued about today. He'd mix it up. I mean, people argue about Asimov and how naive he was about interpersonal relationships. I mean, it's kind of embarrassing to read some of Asimov's stories now, but there wasn't anything particularly politically or socially volatile in Asimov. Heinlein had a gift for putting the nitroglycerin in under the carpet. And if you happened to step on it and it went off, well, guess what? It was there all along, but on a first read, you might not have noticed it at all. And I thought Methuselah's Children was a good example of how you do that kind of science fiction. Would it pass today? Would it even sell today? I don't know. It is kind of, as you pointed out, there's a low level of tension to a contemporary sensibility. Certainly, it would be twice as long today.
If not more, yeah.
If not more, there would be far more detail about the aliens that are encountered, and some of them are kind of, you almost felt like, wait a minute, let's stay here for a while. These seem like really interesting aliens. What is this? What's this all about?
I would have liked to learn more about the ones they weren't exactly a hive mind, but they did have some kind of general sort of like social cohesion. I don't know how to put it. And so Mary Sperling, as you mentioned earlier, now she stays there, right? She decides that instead of risking death as a human, she'd rather kind of join this
corporate entity
and become part of a larger whole that won't die. Yeah.
Right. And, which again Lazarus goes to try to talk her out of it. but in the end, you have to. I think that one of the underappreciated things in Heinlein is that it threaded through most of his fiction. He had a commitment to personal choice, that you have to respect the individual when they finally make their mind up and say, this is what I want to do.
Well, you see that just would have been, to your previous point, that more interesting to learn about this sort of corporate mind, right? Why was Mary so attracted to them? I would like to have, gotten more details and maybe had a conversation with her instead of some other characters saying, "Oh, well, she went and did this later." I guess we do have a short conversation with her, but it seemed like that could have been expanded and would have been very interesting,
Yeah, she recurs in another Lazarus life, and in the later novel, Time Enough for Love, there's a section in there where Lazarus has to confer with her, and he allows that. He went back there, and the question, well, was she still there? Says, oh, well, yeah, she was. They could sort of manifest Mary Spurley. I mean, it's a very brief scene, but it's still there in the background, and it just, a lot of his work related to almost everything he did. And there are little, what we call them Easter eggs now, laced throughout his canon, that once in a while he'd drop a sentence or a paragraph here that referred back to something. And Methuselah's Children was also part of his future history. He was one of the first writers to lay out a timeline of what's going to happen in the future. And occasionally, his is a little freaky, and occasionally you read something in that timeline and go, oh, well, boy, not necessarily the date, but the event is kind of spot on.
Yeah, and this copy of the book, the timeline is actually printed like right in chapter 1 on page 10 and 11. So you get this whole list of what year it is and what stories take place in there and which characters appear in there and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, you even have this whole chart to tell you where this particular book takes place in this whole timeline.
Yeah. He kept going back to the idea of biological manipulation throughout his career. Heinlein himself was subject to some chronic conditions that derailed him career-wise in a number of instances. It's surprising to me that he lived as long as he did. I think he was 88 when he passed away. And, he wanted a career in the Navy. And it turned out that he was constitutionally incapable of serving on a ship. He got massive vertigo, which they didn't find out about. He was originally on he was on an aircraft carrier, I believe. And then they transferred him to a light cruiser, and the size of the ship made all the difference. Suddenly he couldn't get out of his bunk. And then he acquired tuberculosis, and there was that. And there were some other things that were going on. And I'm sure that it obsessed him somewhat if he could get into his genes and change things so that he could be more, and it recurs in his fiction throughout. This is the first example of him playing with the genetic code in a way to produce a quote, better human being. And then later you have two occasionally embarrassing results where he has brain transplants, and let's see if we can beat this biological game, and which leads to some of his more problematic fiction from time to time. I mean, you get to a character like Friday later, who is an artificial person. In all obvious aspects, Friday's a human being, but she is purpose-built to be physically superior and mentally alert. And of course, when it's discovered by the people around her that she's not actually a real human, whatever that means, the shutters come down, they immediately oust her. So this was something that he dealt with repeatedly, people's inability to accept difference And this would, to me, was one of the first ones where that really manifested on a global level. Here's this group of people who are just different, and you could substitute any marginalized group for the Howards and make the same case of what would happen if they'd been living in secret among you and then suddenly revealed themselves. He didn't trust people in large numbers very much. And, you know, his what politics there are. And I defy anybody to read 10 or more Heinlein novels and then come and tell me what his politics actually were. Because he was, in fact, all over the map. And one of my problems over the years being involved in the science fiction community is finding people who are adamantly dismissive of Heinlein because he was this or that or the other thing, and you find out that they've only read 1 or 2 novels and just made the assumption that they're all like that. And no, he was all over the map. I think that he also did that because, by God, you're not going to pin me down. How dare you try to psychoanalyze me according to my fiction?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying you can't do that, but it's not so simple as many people make it out to be.
Yeah, probably the novel most people have heard of and read would be Stranger in a Strange Land.
Which was...
Is an interesting book.
Yeah. To say the least, you kind of read it now and scratch yourself that that was something that a lot of people thought was really cool because it just did all these things that fed into the counterculture at the time, and there were communes based on Michael Smith's family, and it's just like, ugh.
Well, it certainly hit the social consciousness to some level because, I mean, Twitter's AI, right, is Grok.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Grok is still a word that people use in some situations. So
I think it's a handy word. I mean, once you read the book and you understand what it means, it's like, yeah.
I need that word. Why doesn't English have that word, right?
It probably does. I don't know if it's in the official dictionary yet. I could look that up.
Someday someday Merriam-Webster or whoever the British
and
Oxford will adopt it.
And he invented the waterbed in that novel. I think it's true. It's still true that was the first use of something that became a waterbed in fiction, and it may be the first mention of the idea. And of course, he didn't patent it, so. But yeah, Stranger in Strange Land and Starship Troopers seem to be the 2 novels that people take sides on and decide that they're going to categorize Heinlein as one or the other. And it's kind of absurd. He would do experiments more so than most of his contemporaries. He would say, well, let's throw this plate of spaghetti against the wall and see what happens. And sometimes it was just a mess. And then he'd write something else that did something completely different. Do I have problems with Heinlein? Yeah, I have problems with Heinlein. I think there are a lot of things that you could look at and say, well, even then people knew better than this. But do I think he can be dismissed? No. Science fiction would not be what it is today without him to act as a standard. And I don't mean a standard that everybody has to adhere to, but here's this, and what are we going to do in opposition to it, or around it, or I think he's fading finally. I think it's here in 2025, there's less and less of the argument over how he matters to fiction. But now we can, use later writers who were definitely in dialogue with Heinlein, who wrote better material that are now the subject of those kinds of critical debates. But it started back then. The other writer that I think was just as experimental as Heinlein and doesn't get nearly as much grief is Theodore Sturgeon. But, he wrote a hell of a lot more short stories, and there was less polemic, I suppose. I can't think of a Sturgeon story where there's a character that turns around and says, "Now let me tell you what this actually is." He just left it to your imagination, but he was, if anything, more experimental socially than Heinlein was. But this is one of the books that I recommended people. Where do you think I should start with Heinlein? Oh God, I would Methuselah's Children or Universe or any of the really early ones, or the juveniles, which still you have to make some allowances for the changes in time and technology and such. But even now, the juveniles are remarkably readable.
I've read the Star Beast.
Star Beast is I just read that not too long ago, and it's a delightful little story. And Citizen of the Galaxy is a full-on. It addresses slavery and child trafficking and the fact that there are very comfortable people in certain societies that will tell you that that doesn't happen because, well, they've never seen it, and that would make what I do, suspect because I'm not paying attention to that. And that's just, and it's a juvenile. It was pitched at 13-year-olds. And a good example of how Heinlein never talked down to anybody. His juveniles are pitched at the same level of intellectual acuity as any of his other novels. So, not sure why they were considered juveniles, except for the age of the protagonists.
All right. So with some caveats, remember it was written in 1941 or so. Just keep that in mind if you want to pick up the book. But it definitely is a kind of a rollicking good time, an adventure story with some interesting questions about eugenics and us versus them. How do people, sort themselves out? Are there other final thoughts you want to give on the book?
It's a lesson in context. I think that's it's a good story. It's well written, and it's dated. But if you keep in mind when it was written and against the social background against which it's written, you can see that it was a radical piece of work and rather quaint now. And it's nice when things like that can become quaint because that means we've had some progress, and these are not issues in the same way anymore. We can move on to other problems. And it's a good introduction, I think, to what he was capable of if you pay attention to his subtexts.
Thanks very much for your time, Mark. We'll be back again for more classic reads in the future. And so if you want to check out some Heinlein, check out Methuselah's Children. See you next time. Remember, hit like and subscribe. Bye-bye.